Malik James stands in O'Hare Airport, hoodie pulled low, first-class ticket in hand. But none of it matters. A blonde flight attendant sneers, rips his ticket, and calls security, blind to the fact that Malik owns the airline. Her icy, "You don't belong," isn't just prejudice, it's a match to gasoline. Cameras roll, phones light up. The crowd watches a billionaire black man treated like a criminal. Malik stays calm, but beneath that silence, a fire brews. What happens next will explode far beyond this terminal. Think racism's dead? Think again. Subscribe now, because this story is about to flip the system. Malik James moved through the thick hum of O'Hare's terminal like a shadow in plain sight. Hoodie faded, jeans loose, sneakers silent on the polished tiles. He didn't look like a billionaire today. No suit, no entourage, no flash. But beneath that quiet surface was the mind that built Skybridge Airlines from scrap metal and second chances. A man who climbed from a roach-infested apartment on Chicago's South Side to owning the sky, now reduced to just another suspect in a space he designed for comfort and class. He'd bought the airline to change the culture, to make flying feel human again. For everyone. But today, the system came to remind him of what it really sees when it sees him. He approached the first-class desk, ticket ready, chin up, knowing he wasn't supposed to blend in but refusing to stand out. Not yet. The flight attendant, a woman with bright blonde hair and a badge that read Kristen, looked him up and down like he was dirt-tracked in from the street. "Economy's that way," she snapped, not even glancing at the ticket he extended. Just his skin, just his clothes, just his presence. Malik didn't raise his voice, didn't flex the weight of his power. He simply replied, "First class," with a calm that came from surviving 100 scenes just like this. But Kristen scoffed, grabbed the ticket, squinted, and without a blink, tore it in half. The paper fluttered to the counter like his dignity wasn't worth the ink. "Fraud," she said. "I'm calling security." And just like that, it began. Phones went up. Bystanders froze. A white man in a vest whispered, "That's the guy from the news, the airline guy." But it didn't stop the guards from coming. Didn't stop Kristen from pointing and whispering lies as thick as molasses. Malik's voice didn't rise as two men in blue pinned him at the elbow and dragged him toward a side hall. "You've made a mistake," he said, unlocking his phone with one hand and opening the app. The Skybridge Internal Executive app, something only 7 people in the world could access. He held it up. Malik James, CEO and owner, glowing bold on the screen. One guard hesitated. But the other? He twisted Malik's arm back like it was nothing and muttered, "Save it for court." Malik didn't flinch when they cuffed him. He didn't scream when they shoved him into a dim holding room beneath the terminal. But inside, his blood was a thunderstorm, silent and violent. The cop, Officer Dennett, grinned like he'd just bagged a trophy. Then came the ultimate insult. A small plastic bag pulled from Dennett's pocket, filled with white powder, held up like a prize before it was planted into Malik's carry-on. "Now you've got real problems," Dennett smirked. No words could describe that moment, watching a lie settle into his belongings like a poison waiting to be believed. But Malik wasn't new to this. He'd survived eviction, profiling, threats, slander, a youth record sealed but never forgotten. He knew this system. He'd built a billion-dollar airline not to escape it, but to expose it. Still cuffed, he dragged himself to the corner of the room, pulled a payphone receiver off its cradle, and dialed a number he'd memorized long ago. Monica Graves, his lawyer, his shield, the kind of woman who could dismantle a police report before it was even filed. She picked up on the first ring. "Tell me what they did," she said. He kept it simple. Planted drugs, first-class ticket. Kristen tore it. They're framing me. No drama, no panic, just facts. Because with racism, this bold, facts were his only ammunition. Monica moved fast. Within 45 minutes, footage from the terminal, captured by a teenager and posted on X, was trending under #JusticeForMalik. The video was clear. Malik calm, composed, respectful. Kristen? Hostile, arrogant. The moment she tore the ticket? Captured. The moment she called him a fraud? Captured. The cuffs? Captured. The bystanders' outrage? Explosive. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. News vans flooded the airport. Protesters gathered outside. Skybridge's executive board flooded Malik's phone with messages of panic, support, and disbelief. The airline stock wobbled. Customers demanded answers. And while Kristen was quietly escorted out of the building by corporate, Malik was still locked up beneath the terminal, still cuffed, still waiting. Dennett watched the chaos unfold with a sour frown, until Monica walked in, fire in her eyes and evidence in hand. "You're done," she told him, showing the footage, the app, the proof. "Release him, now!" And they did. But the story wasn't over. Malik stepped back into the light, bruised but unbroken, the red marks on his wrists a badge of every black man who'd ever been told, "You don't belong." The crowd parted. Some cheered, some filmed. A little girl in pigtails clutched her mother's coat and whispered, "That's the man from the video." Sir Malik nodded to her, not smiling but solid, knowing he was now more than a businessman. He was a symbol. But just when it seemed he'd won, just when Kristen was fired and Dennett suspended, a new storm gathered. Malik's phone buzzed. A text. No sender. Just a photo of his daughter walking to school. The message? "Watch your back." That's when Malik knew. This wasn't just about a ticket. It wasn't just about Kristen or Dennett. It was about a system threatened by his presence, his success, his power. He'd stirred something ancient, something violent. And now it wanted to remind him that no matter how high he flew, someone would try to clip his wings. But Malik wasn't going down. He doubled his security, put cameras on his daughter's school, took to every screen that would host him. He spoke on every talk show, stood in front of every camera and said, "This wasn't personal. It's systemic. It's not just about me. It's about every black person told they don't belong in spaces we built with our sweat, our genius, our resilience." The world listened. Skybridge's customer base exploded. Activists rallied behind him. Kristen tried to sue for defamation. She lost. Officer Dennett was indicted. And Malik? He didn't just bounce back. He rose higher. Skybridge's new campaign slogan launched 2 weeks later. "Belonging at 30,000 feet." So what do you think? Should Malik have stayed quiet? Or did he do what needed to be done? Drop A in the comments if you stand with him. And hit that subscribe button if you're riding with truth, justice, and the voices that refuse to be silenced. Because this story, it's far from over. Malik James never expected the sky he once dreamed of owning to become the storm that nearly destroyed him. From the cracked concrete steps of a South Side apartment to boardrooms with glass ceilings, he shattered. Malik's life had been a war fought in silence, a war of grit, of coded smiles and sealed fates. But nothing prepared him for the moment. A flight attendant at his own airline looked him in the eye, sized him up, and shredded his first-class ticket like it was trash, and he was nothing more than a fraud trying to slip into a space never meant for him. He wore no suit that day, just a hoodie, a soft, gray, threadbare one he'd had since college. He'd walked into O'Hare Airport, not as the billionaire CEO of Skybridge Airlines, but as a regular passenger, quietly testing his airline's customer service to see what passengers really experienced. What he got instead was a front-row seat to the kind of racism that had haunted his youth, ugly, casual, and confidently executed. The humiliation started like a whisper, but ended like a siren. As Kristen, the flight attendant, snatched his ticket and told him, "Economy's that way," Malik's blood ran cold. He calmly replied, "I'm first class," and extended his boarding pass, but her eyes narrowed and her mouth twisted in a cruel smile that reeked of superiority. Then, rip! The sound of his ticket tearing echoed louder than the intercom. The pieces landed in the trash with a kind of finality that mirrored how he felt. Discarded. Invisible. Erased. But that wasn't the worst part. It was when security grabbed him, cuffed him in front of a crowd of confused, whispering onlookers, and dragged him into a back hallway like a criminal, that the old trauma came flooding back. The time he was 14, face down on the pavement, knee in his back because he fit the description. The time he got denied a lease in a high-rise he could have bought cash because the units were full. The time he sat in a board meeting and had an investor ask if he was in the wrong room. The sting of it all wasn't new, but this time it came from his own empire, under his own roof, from staff he paid. Thrown into a cramped holding room beneath the terminal, still cuffed, Malik's mind raced. His wrist ached. The steel bit into his skin, but the deeper pain came from the violation of everything he had built. He'd fought to create Skybridge as a brand of dignity and equity, a place where no passenger felt beneath anyone else. And now? Now he was sitting in a windowless box, being called a fraud, while the real fraud, Kristen, told lies upstairs to protect her image. Officer Dennett, a tall, broad man with cold blue eyes and a permanent sneer, smirked at him from the corner. "You people always think you're special," he muttered, pacing with a swagger that said he'd done this before. Malik's phone, which held proof of his identity and ownership of Skybridge, was locked in an evidence bag across the room. Dennett had called it a decoy device. Then, to Malik's horror, the officer reached into his coat, pulled out a small plastic bag, and dropped it into Malik's carry-on. "Guess we've got ourselves a drug mule," he said. The words felt like knives, each syllable slicing away at Malik's dignity. He stared at the planted evidence, his lungs burning with rage and helplessness. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a setup. When Monica Graves, his longtime attorney and friend, stormed into the station with evidence, security footage, and a viral video from a bystander showing the entire altercation, Malik was freed. But his body trembled as he stood, his muscles aching from the cuffs, his eyes dry and hollow. The victory was shallow. The damage had been done. He walked out of the airport into a crowd of cameras and protesters, holding up his wrist to show the marks left behind. "This," he said hoarsely, "is what happens when your skin speaks louder than your name." For a brief moment, public outrage worked in his favor. Kristen was fired. Officer Dennett was placed on leave pending investigation. Skybridge Airlines issued a corporate apology. The footage dominated headlines. Malik's calm under fire made him a symbol. But symbols, he learned, attract enemies. Just days later, he received the first threat. A photo of his daughter, 10 years old, exiting her school. The words, "Watch her back," scribbled in red across the image. His chest collapsed inward. He increased her security, changed their routines, moved her temporarily to a safe house outside the city, but fear lodged itself into his heart like a splinter. Then his sister's diner, the family's legacy, the one they built in memory of their late mother, was firebombed in the dead of night. Malik stood outside the ashes, breathing in the burnt remains of framed pictures, recipes, and childhood memories. The arsonist left a message spray-painted across the back wall. "Take the sky, lose the ground." Still, Malik didn't stop. He went on air. He exposed Officer Dennett. He told the world what happened, not just to him, but to so many others without cameras or apps or lawyers. He was hailed as a hero. Until Ellis returned. Deputy Chief Ellis, Kristen's uncle, used his influence to launch a smear campaign. Leaked fake wire transfers to claim Malik paid protesters, claimed the airport scene was staged, even sent militiamen to burn Malik's house down. His mansion, his sanctuary, was reduced to rubble. He stood in the street barefoot in the cold night, smoke curling through the trees, coughing, eyes burning, his memories and trophies charred to dust. He built that house with his first real paycheck, laid the foundation stone with his daughter's initials etched into it. He rebuilt again. But the attacks kept coming. Vanessa, Kristen's real name, sued him for $50 million for wrongful termination, alleging reverse discrimination. Her lies were broadcast across right-wing media, and suddenly Malik was no longer the victim. He was the villain. Protesters swarmed Skybridge offices. Shares dipped. Flights were boycotted. Then came the ambush. Malik's car was rammed off Lakeshore Drive by masked men with bats and guns. He dove into a ditch with a fractured shoulder, cuts on his face, glass in his mouth. The police arrived late. Too late. They didn't even chase the attackers. As he lay in a hospital bed, broken in body, shattered in spirit, it was Camille, his second in command, his rock, who stood by him. She handled the company while he healed. She was the only one he trusted, until the night of the Skybridge Gala, when a whistleblower stepped up to the mic and played a recording. Camille's voice, clear, cold. "Ellis burns it. I'll handle the board. He's out. I'm in." The betrayal cut deeper than all the bullets and flames. She wanted his empire, worked with Ellis, helped plan the hits. She hugged his daughter, laughed in his home, toasted him while plotting his downfall. He couldn't cry, couldn't speak, just stood frozen as Camille was cuffed and dragged out. The crowd murmured. Some applauded. Others just watched. The trust he'd held for 20 years crumbled in seconds. Malik's name was cleared. Vanessa's suit was dismissed. Ellis was convicted. The truth came out, but so did the scars. His daughter still flinched at night noises. His sister's diner reopened, but she jumped every time a car backfired. His staff was shaken. His heart was heavy. He returned to Skybridge with more security, more cameras, more suspicion. His smile never quite reached his eyes again. He donated millions to anti-racist programs, launched the Every Seat Equal initiative, and wrote a memoir. But there was always a whisper at his back, a threat lingering in the silence. Because the biggest lie is that hate dies when the story ends. Malik knew better. He knew it hides in new names, new laws, new uniforms. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to run an airline, raise his daughter, breathe. But now every moment of peace came with a price. And yet he stood, bruised, betrayed, burned, and broken, but never bowed. The Cuffs slammed around Jordan Price's wrists in the middle of the gleaming O'Hare terminal. Everything he'd built, every late night, every closed-door battle, every scar he'd buried behind polished speeches and billion-dollar deals, collapsed into silence. He didn't yell. He didn't resist. His pulse roared louder than the security guard's accusations, louder than the rip of the first-class ticket that Kristen, the smug flight attendant, had torn like she was tossing a used napkin. The humiliation burned hotter than the overhead lights, and yet Jordan's face remained carved from calm, his brown eyes fixed, jaw clenched, chest rising in steady rhythm, though every breath felt like broken glass. How do you explain to the world that the system you own just tried to erase you? He wasn't some name on a no-fly list. He was the owner of North Star Airlines. But to them, just another black man in a hoodie, just another mistake that would be quietly swept away, unless he stood up again and bled for the truth. They dragged him into a holding cell, the concrete floor as cold as the tone in Officer Hargrove's voice when he leaned close and whispered, "You don't belong here, boy." Jordan didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. The walls reeked of mildew and stale sweat, the same air he once breathed growing up in the back rooms of Section 8 housing, where paint peeled from ceilings and ambition was a thing you smothered to survive. And now, in this cage beneath a terminal named after a war hero, Jordan stared at his reflection in the scratched metal wall, manacled, silenced, stripped. They planted drugs. They laughed. They dared him to scream. But he didn't. He dialed one number. Ava Tate, his lawyer, his lifeline. He said 5 words. They planted. It's a setup. That was all she needed? What came next? A wildfire. A teenager's video clip hit social media like a thunderbolt. Kristen ripping his ticket, security pinning him down, the app flashing his title, owner and CEO. Justice. For Jordan exploded across timelines. Millions watched. The press swarmed. The CEO in cuffs. The founder on the floor. And when Ava stormed into the precinct, waving footage and legal threats, they couldn't release him fast enough. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a man in a hoodie walking back through O'Hare with red marks on his wrists and smoke in his lungs. But the damage wasn't done with him. It came for his sister next. She owned a hair salon. Legacy Hair and Beauty, a small shop in Bronzeville where their mother used to braid hair for rent money. Jordan had helped her build it into something proud. Then came the threats, a brick through the window. "Stay in your lane," scrawled in black spray paint across the door. She called him sobbing. "I don't feel safe." Jordan didn't hesitate. He hired guards, installed cameras, reassured her. But the guilt? That crept in like a sickness. She's paying the price for your truth. And the enemies? They weren't shadows. They had names. Vanessa Kristen Reed went on national television 2 days later, smiling through painted lips, crying on cue. "He threatened me," she said. "He said I'd pay." Her story flipped the script. No mention of the ticket, no footage of the tear, just tears of her own, sweetened lies dripping into the ears of networks hungry for controversy. The right-wing echo chamber latched on. "Discrimination against white workers! CEO bullies flight attendant!" Protesters picketed North Star HQ. One man spit on Jordan's car windshield as he arrived for a board meeting. He was no longer a victim. He was a target. But Jordan didn't crumble. Not yet. He stood in front of cameras and said, "This isn't about one woman. This is about a pattern. This is about who gets to belong. He released the footage. His support surged. Stocks rebounded. Kristen was fired. Hargrove suspended. The board backed him. Barely. And then came the lawsuit. Kristen returned in a red blazer and filed a $50 million suit for wrongful termination, claiming racial discrimination. He fired me because I'm white, she told the press. He used me to score woke points. And just like that, the story twisted again. Jordan's inbox flooded with threats. You're the real racist. Hope your plane crashes. His daughter's school went into lockdown after an anonymous tip falsely claimed he had ties to gangs. His private life was dissected, smeared, brutalized. Old photos, court records from his youth. A traffic ticket became a headline. The fire started to burn not just around him, but in him. Not rage, not fear. Exhaustion. A soul-deep ache he couldn't shake. How many times could he be told to prove he was human? And then his home burned. Arson. A Molotov through his front window. His daughter was there. 12 years old. She woke to smoke and sirens. Jordan carried her out barefoot, choking, crying. The police called it a protest gone wrong. No arrests, just a shrug. Keep a lower profile, they said. As if silence was safety. But Jordan had already decided. If they're going to come for me anyway, I might as well speak louder. He launched Project Airwave, an initiative to expose systemic racism in corporate travel and airport policing. He met with senators. He sat with civil rights leaders. He poured millions into advocacy. He told his story again and again and again, even when it broke him to repeat it. Even when the words stuck in his throat like glass. Even when his voice trembled with grief for the childhood friend who didn't survive his encounter with police. I made it out, Jordan said once on a podcast, but the system is designed to remind me I don't belong, unless I own it. For a moment, he felt the tide shift, until the attack in the parking garage. 2 men waited for him after a fundraiser. They wore ski masks, carried bats. You ruined her life, one growled. Now we'll ruin yours. Jordan fought. He landed punches, took hits, ended up in the ER with a shattered rib, a concussion, and a swollen jaw. The men got away. Again, no arrests. But that night, Jordan stood in the mirror, shirtless, bruises blooming like purple flowers across his chest, and wondered how much more he could take. What more do I have to lose to be heard? And as he looked at the raw red mark across his stomach from where a bat cracked his ribs, he whispered the truth he'd buried too long. I'm tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of smiling. Tired of pretending that justice was around the next corner. But then came the message. A card slid under his hospital room door. Handwritten. No signature. Just 4 words. Don't let them win. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some Hollywood moment. But it snapped something back into place. He didn't know who wrote it. A nurse? A stranger? A supporter? Didn't matter. What mattered was that someone saw him. Really saw him. So here he stands. Rib-wrapped. Jaw healing. Voice steady. In front of the world again. Speaking not just for himself, but for every black person who's been silenced, sidelined, torn down in plain sight. He stands because sitting is what they want. He speaks because silence is what they expect. He builds because destruction is what they planned. And still, he bleeds. And now we ask you, yes, you reading this, do you believe in him? Do you believe he deserves peace? That his daughter deserves safety? That his sister's salon deserves to thrive, not smolder? That this man, bruised but breathing, deserves a system that sees him fully? Then show it. Drop a like right now to support Jordan's fight. Comment, if you stand with him. And hit subscribe to keep this story alive. Because if he's going to keep fighting, he shouldn't be fighting alone. No one knows exactly what Elijah Cross did the night the lights went out in Chicago, but everyone's still talking about it. A man who was once just a quiet figure behind a billion-dollar tech empire. An unshakable, sharp-dressed CEO who kept his name out of tabloids and his hands clean, is now at the center of something so wild, so impossible, people whisper like it's folklore. All anyone knows is he walked into that federal courthouse on Tuesday morning wearing a hoodie and walking with a limp. And by nightfall, 2 government agents had resigned, 3 security systems had crashed, and a sealed case involving the Department of Defense had mysteriously reopened. But Elijah? He hasn't said a word. Not to the press, not to the public, not even to his closest friends. The only thing he said, quietly, in passing, to a stunned intern who happened to hold the elevator was, "Sometimes you have to do something impossible just to remind them you exist." That was it. And now the world's unraveling pieces of a story that doesn't want to be found. It started, they say, with a flight. Flight 471 from New York to Chicago. Elijah sat in seat 1A, sunglasses on, hoodie up, backpack tucked between his feet. First class, obviously, but you wouldn't know it. No assistants, no flash, just a man with tired eyes and a silence that made people uneasy. The flight landed late. A thunderstorm had snarled the skies, and the delay was blamed on weather. But the truth? That storm didn't start in the clouds. It started the moment Elijah boarded, and someone recognized him. Not a fan, not an ally, someone else. That night, security footage shows Elijah being pulled aside at the gate. Quiet, voluntary. No cuffs, no scene, no. But no one could explain why 2 plainclothes federal agents had been waiting for him at the terminal, or why airport security cameras glitched out for 12 minutes during the escort to a black SUV. Or why the vehicle never arrived at the field office. Or why, 2 hours later, North Star Tower, the government's off-grid data hub, went completely dark. What happened during those 2 hours? That's where the mystery swells. No witnesses, no clear timeline. Just breadcrumbs, a wiped access log, a shattered firewall, and a chilling discovery made by a cybersecurity watchdog. Elijah's encrypted signature buried deep inside a military-grade drone control patch, a signature that should have been impossible to forge. The problem? Elijah wasn't a criminal. He was a builder. A man who had designed the very software North Star now used to fly surveillance drones in unofficial territories. The same software he'd sold the government a decade ago in good faith. But something had changed. Something had cracked. Some line had been crossed. And no one knows what triggered him. What did he see? Some say it was a video. Others claim it was a file. Coded, redacted, buried in a ghost server. But whatever it was, Elijah's expression when he left that black SUV hours later said everything. Rage buried under resignation. Not loud, not angry, just quiet. Cold and calculated. The kind of face you wear when you've decided to burn a system from the inside. When you know the only way out is all the way through. From there, the impossible unfolded like dominoes. He disappeared for 2 days. No trace, no sightings. His phone off. His condo empty. but his digital fingerprints were everywhere. A backdoor hack hit the Federal Comms Authority at 2:17 a.m. Then came a cascade. 5 locked files dumped anonymously onto the dark web. Files that detailed illegal surveillance operations, racial profiling algorithms embedded in facial recognition tech, and predictive AI being used to silently target Black and brown communities under the guise of future crime prevention. Code Elijah helped design. Code they had corrupted. Files that shouldn't exist. Files that only he could have known about. And suddenly, the narrative flipped. Elijah wasn't missing. He was on the move. And what he did next? It's hard to even believe. He showed up at the Sky Court building, one of the most secure data vaults in the Midwest, dressed as a janitor, ID scanned, walked past 3 guards and into a restricted server room with nothing but a duffel bag and a fire suppression override key. No alarm was triggered. No footage was captured. But 20 minutes later, every screen in the building flashed a single message. They watched. He warned. You ignored. And then the entire East Wing's servers crashed, wiping 5 years of federal surveillance records in seconds. What was Elijah trying to hide? Or was he trying to reveal by the time agents pieced together his moves? Elijah had already returned to Chicago. But instead of running, he walked right into the courthouse. Calm, alone, hoodie on. Blood still dried on his knuckles from who knows what. He didn't request a lawyer, didn't make a statement. Just handed over a hard drive and said, "This ends with truth." Then sat down. And waited. The drive? That's where things spiraled. Inside were records of contracts, tapes, emails, confirmations of unethical deals, proof of violations hidden under coded legal jargon, footage of drone strikes misclassified as accidental system errors, data scrubbed from existence by government-paid firms. He had it all. All of it. It was like he'd built a kill switch from the moment he started working for them. A self-destruct lever tucked inside a quiet man's mind for 10 long years. But here's the twist. Elijah didn't leak the drive. He didn't post it. He didn't sell it. He handed it to the same people who betrayed him, because he wanted to see what they'd do with it. He gave them a chance. A shot at redemption. And what did they do? They called him a terrorist. The headlines were instant. Tech CEO caught in cyber espionage scheme. Drone hacker or digital vigilante? The Elijah Cross scandal. Betrayal from within. His name was scorched across every screen. His past dredged up. A mugshot from when he was 17, falsely arrested at a protest, was plastered everywhere. He's always been a problem, pundits sneered. Just took longer to show it. But the people? They saw something different. They saw a man who sacrificed everything, his company, his name, his freedom, for a truth no one wanted to touch. They saw a black man who'd tried to play by the rules, build the system better, and got burned by it anyway. So instead, he lit a fuse. Now he's out on bond, ankle monitor blinking, barred from tech access, forbidden from travel, silenced by a gag order, but still watching, still planning. And rumors say he's not done, that there's a second drive, one even bigger, that he gave the first to test them. And they failed. They buried the files, sealed the documents, arrested a whistleblower 2 days later, thought they could kill the spark. But the spark became a storm. People are marching now, demanding oversight. Tech firms are scrambling. Agencies are being audited. Elijah's name is being spoken like a prayer by some, a curse by others. And through it all, He walks the city at night, hoodie up, hands in his pockets, blending in again, like he always did, like the world forgot he was a king when he didn't wear the crown. And still, he won't speak. He won't confirm, won't deny. He just shows up. Silent. Sharp. And every time someone asks, "Why did you do it?" he gives the same look. Part pain, part peace. The look of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. So now we ask you, yeah, you listening right now, what do you think Elijah did? Do you think he burned the system on purpose? Do you think he's planning something bigger? Or did he make the ultimate sacrifice just to open our eyes? Drop a comment on 1 if you think Elijah did what had to be done. Or 2 if you think he went too far. And if you're as hooked on this mystery as we are, smash that like button to show Elijah he's not alone. Because whether he's a traitor or a hero, there's one truth no one can deny. He lit the fire. And now the whole world is watching what burns next. Nobody knew what Ava Morgan had survived. Not really. They only saw the poised woman who stood on courthouse steps with her hands folded, head high, voice calm. They saw the polished lawyer with a perfect conviction record and a reputation for taking on cases nobody else would touch. But they didn't see the nights she slept in her car because returning home was too dangerous. They didn't see the burns on her shoulder from that fire, the one started not by accident, but by design. They didn't see the fear in her eyes when she walked her little brother to school, constantly looking over her shoulder, praying today wasn't the day someone made good on the threats. They didn't know that behind that powerful gaze was a truth she'd held close for years. She wasn't just a lawyer fighting injustice, she was the evidence it existed. It all started with Case 3118, a case no one else wanted. A young black man named Darius was arrested for armed robbery, accused of holding up a corner store with a weapon he never touched, caught on a surveillance camera that just so happened to glitch at the moment of the crime. No fingerprints, no motive, just his skin and proximity to a crime someone else committed. Ava saw the files, saw the inconsistencies, saw the racism so deeply baked into the paperwork it was almost invisible. She took the case. She stood in that courtroom alone against a system built to break her client. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that this wasn't just any case. It was connected to something bigger, something darker, something that reached into the pockets of police brass, crooked attorneys, and a judge who'd built a legacy on locking up black boys. When Ava requested internal footage from the precinct, footage that would prove Darius's innocence, the threats began. First, anonymous texts. Drop the case. Then came the letters slid under her office door. Then the fire at her apartment. She barely escaped, her lungs filled with smoke. Her cats died. Her laptop, full of notes, evidence, confidential client data, gone. She filed a police report. They shrugged. Electrical, they said. She looked at the officer who wrote it down, one of the same names on the precinct footage request, and she knew. She couldn't quit. Not now. So she worked in silence, borrowed tech, moved into a friend's guest room, showed up every day in the courtroom with documents reprinted from memory. She memorized entire depositions in the shower, ate cold ramen at 2 a.m. while reviewing legal precedent, slept with one eye open. But the worst part? The isolation. She couldn't tell her family. Not after the last time someone she loved paid the price. Her mother was already gone, killed in a hit-and-run Ava knew was no accident, but had no way to prove. Her father had walked out when she was 6. But her little brother Jordan, he was still here. He was her world. And that meant silence was safety. He never knew how many nights she sat outside his school in a borrowed car just to make sure no one followed him home. And yet, she kept going. Every time the prosecution twisted the facts, she unraveled them. When they brought in a paid witness, she found the footage that proved he'd never even been at the scene. When they claimed Darius had priors, she pulled sealed juvenile records that showed he'd been profiled before. Stopped at 14 for looking suspicious while walking to church. Piece by piece, she chipped away at the lie. Until one day, a flash drive arrived in a plain envelope on her windshield. No note, just footage. Crystal clear. It showed Darius standing blocks away from the scene at the exact moment of the crime. It had been buried, hidden, and whoever sent it was taking a huge risk. She brought it to court. The judge tried to reject it. "Too late," he said. But Ava didn't sit down. She stood her ground, citing case law with a voice that shook but never cracked. "You don't get to hide the truth just because it's inconvenient." The courtroom fell silent. The judge glared, but he knew he couldn't stop it. Not with the cameras rolling, not with the public watching. The footage played. Darius was innocent, but the case didn't end there, because Ava made a decision that would change everything. She went public. She stood outside the courthouse and told the world what she knew, that corruption lived in the same buildings where justice was supposed to breathe. That if they had buried this footage, how many others had been buried? That her fire, her trauma, her losses, they weren't personal. They were systemic. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Not from weakness, but from years of holding back. She named names, officers, attorneys, even the judge. She had nothing left to lose, and within 24 hours, she was suspended from the bar. They called it professional misconduct. Said she violated protocol. Said she compromised the integrity of the case, even though it was already compromised by the people who tried to bury the truth. But Ava wasn't shocked. She'd expected it. What she didn't expect: the people. The flood of strangers, young lawyers, former clients, mothers, sons, teachers, students, all rallying behind her. A hashtag spread like wildfire. Stand with Ava. Donations poured in. Protesters stood outside the courthouse every day with signs that read, "Truth is not misconduct." Darius's case went viral. The judge was forced into early retirement. An internal investigation was launched. And Ava? She kept walking forward. Suspended or not, she started an independent justice initiative, the Morgan Project, to review wrongful convictions and coach new lawyers on navigating systemic traps. She worked from borrowed offices, basements, cafes, even park benches. She took no salary, slept little, but her heart beat with purpose. And one day, in the mail, a letter arrived. From the Bar Association. No apology, no explanation, just one sentence: "Your license has been reinstated." She read it 3 times, tears spilling quietly onto the envelope. But it wasn't the license that mattered. It was the voice she'd reclaimed, and she used it. Darius graduated last month. Full scholarship. Pre-law. When he hugged Ava after the ceremony, he whispered, "You didn't just save me. You saved the version of me I didn't think I'd ever get to be." That was the moment she let herself cry, for everything she'd lost, but also for what she'd protected. A boy. A future. A truth. And now? Ava's name is still whispered, but not in fear, in hope. The same courthouse that once tried to bury her story now bears her quote in its lobby. Silence protects the system, speaking shatters it. And every time she steps through those doors, now fully reinstated, now fully seen, she walks not just as a lawyer, but as living proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a broken world is not break. So now we ask you, yeah, you reading this, you've heard her truth, you've seen the fire she's walked through, you know what she gave up and what she fought to build again. So, if you believe her journey matters, if Ava Morgan's courage hit your heart like it hit ours, drop a comment, "Heart," right now to show her that she's not standing alone. And smash that like button if her fight lit a fire in you too, because truth like hers deserves more than silence. It deserves your voice. From the outside, Micah Lane looked like a man with nothing to hide. His voice was calm, his clothes clean, his name respected. But if anyone had truly looked, really looked, they would have seen the storm behind his eyes, the weight pressing down on his shoulders, the trembling in his fingers when no one was watching, because what Micah did wasn't something you could confess without risking everything. Not just a job, not just a reputation, everything. The moment he chose to break the code of silence, to step out of the shadows and reveal the truth, he knew he might not survive it. But what choice did he have? When the system you serve turns into a machine that swallows people like you whole, staying silent feels like slow death. So Micah spoke, and once he did, there was no going back. He'd been an internal compliance officer at the Department of Civil Oversight for nearly 7 years. On paper, his job was to identify patterns of abuse and recommend policy corrections. In reality, his job was to disappear complaints, bury them under mountains of jargon, label them inconclusive, write reports that sounded like concern but delivered nothing. And at first, Micah did it, justified it, told himself he was doing what he had to do to stay employed. But every time he watched a mother cry because her son was arrested for a crime he didn't commit, every time a whistleblower vanished from the database, every time a black man's name became another statistic in a file that never reached daylight, a piece of Micah died. Until finally, one day, he found a file he couldn't ignore. It was labeled Case DCO 161. Just numbers, just another file. But inside, a report about a 13-year-old boy, Elias Harper, accused of assaulting an officer. The photos showed bruises on the boy's face. The officer claimed Elias had resisted arrest, but the video footage, unredacted, time-stamped, real, showed the truth. Elias never fought back. He was crying. He was begging. "Please, I didn't do anything." And then came the punch. Then the knee. Then the cuffs. Micah watched the tape 6 times in a row, bile rising in his throat each time. When he asked where the footage came from, his manager looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Delete it. We're closing the case." And that's when Micah made the decision that would shatter his entire life. He copied the file. He knew it was illegal. He knew his computer was monitored. He didn't care. He sent it anonymously to a reporter, thought he'd done the right thing, thought justice would follow. But justice never showed up. Instead, the reporter vanished. The station ran a vague retraction. The article was scrubbed from the internet. And 3 days later, Micah received a message in his personal email. "We know it was you." That was the moment the fear set in. Not the kind you see in action movies, but the slow, creeping kind. The kind that leaks into your sleep. He changed his passwords, switched phones, took different routes to work. And still, they found him. He was suspended. Pending investigation, a month later, fired for breach of protocol. His reputation? Destroyed. Whispers of theft, fraud, sabotage. The same people who used to ask him for help now crossed the street to avoid him. He tried to fight it, hired lawyers, filed appeals, but the silence on the other end was deafening. Doors closed. Funding vanished. Friends disappeared. And yet, none of it compared to what came next. Late one night, he came home to find his apartment ransacked. Drawers open, papers torn, and on the wall, in black spray paint, "Keep your mouth shut." That night, he didn't sleep, just sat in the hallway, knees to his chest, flashlight in one hand, baseball bat in the other. He wanted to scream, to burn something. But all he could do was breathe. And even that hurt. He was evicted 2 weeks later. "Safety concerns," the landlord said. He couch-surfed after that, lived out of a duffel bag. The same man who once reviewed million-dollar oversight contracts now lived off gas station sandwiches and second-hand shoes. But still, he didn't give up. He gathered every file he could, built a paper trail, drove across 3 states to meet with civil rights lawyers who might listen. Some did. Most didn't. No legal standing. Too risky. No jurisdiction. The last one said, "I believe you, but we'd lose everything trying to fight this." He almost gave up then. Almost. But one night, sitting in a diner just outside Atlanta, a waitress named Dee overheard him talking to himself. She said, "Whatever it is you're carrying, don't let them make you forget why you picked it up." It wasn't much. Just a sentence. But it stuck. That night he posted his story anonymously. Not the names, not the files, just the pain, the truth, the cost. He didn't expect it to go viral, but it did. By morning, "What Micah Knows" was trending. People begged for more. They called him brave, called him a hero. He didn't feel like one, but something in him cracked open. He released a clip from the Elias Harper file. Just 1 minute of footage. Just enough. The world saw a crying boy in handcuffs, begging to go home. The world saw what Micah saw. And the world got angry. News stations called. Legal aid flooded in. Micah gave them everything. The files, the names, the timelines. Civil rights groups rallied. Congressional hearings were called. The Department of Civil Oversight was dragged into the light. Lawsuits followed. And finally, Elias's record was cleared. The officer was fired. Micah? He wasn't given an award. He didn't get a book deal. He still had nightmares, still flinched at shadows, still had to rebuild from nothing. But he did. Bit by bit. He started working with youth advocates, started teaching community groups how to request public records, started helping others navigate the very system that tried to break him. He lives simply now. Still doesn't talk much. Still carries the weight. But if you ask him, was it worth it? He'll look you in the eye and say, "If I hadn't done it, who would have?" And maybe that's the question we all have to ask ourselves. Because what Micah did wasn't easy. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't safe. But it was right. And now we ask you, yes, you, if you were moved by Micah's story. If you believe that his sacrifice should never be forgotten. If you know how hard it is to speak up when the silence feels like survival. Drop a comment, fire, below to show him he's not standing alone. And hit that like button to let him know we hear him. We see him. We stand with him. Because if the world had more people like Micah Lane, maybe it wouldn't take so much pain just to get to the truth. The storm had passed, but its weight still lived in the bones of every step Aaliyah Moore took. She walked slower now, not from weakness, but from wisdom. From learning that not every fire leaves smoke behind, and not every scar stays visible. But she had survived. That, in itself, was a miracle. The truth she once carried like a secret brick in her chest had finally been spoken aloud. The lies, the pain, the betrayal, the moments she doubted herself, doubted her strength, doubted if she'd make it through. Those chapters were real. But they weren't the end of her story. Not even close. And as she stepped through the front doors of Moore House, the community center she had built from nothing but grief and grit, she knew the fight she had lived through wasn't just for herself. It was for every woman who had been silenced, every kid who had been judged before they could even dream, every truth the world tried to bury. And now, she was planting them in the light. It had taken years, years of struggle, of small victories and silent nights filled with the echoes of "Why me?" and "What now?" Aaliyah remembered every face that doubted her, every voice that told her to quit, every institution that turned its back the moment she refused to play their game. She remembered standing in a courtroom, her voice shaking as she told the truth about the department head who tried to frame her for embezzlement because she wouldn't cover up his misconduct. She remembered the way people whispered afterward, "She's done. They'll ruin her. She should have kept her head down." But what they didn't know was that Aaliyah had already survived worse. She had survived poverty, survived losing her mother at 14, survived being the only black woman in every boardroom she walked into, survived the nights of sleeping in her office because no one else believed in her vision enough to fund it. She had already been broken and rebuilt by life. And when they tried to finish her off, all they really did was give her a reason to rise higher. And rise she did. Not immediately, not cleanly. There were losses, friends who vanished, mentors who distanced themselves, reporters who twisted her story to fit a more palatable narrative. Angry, difficult, unstable. Those words haunted her headlines, but not her heart. Because inside, Aaliyah held the truth. And eventually, the truth held her back. It started with one reporter, one woman who listened, really listened, and saw past the smear campaign. Her interview aired online. Aaliyah spoke softly, but with power. "Sometimes the system doesn't need to kill you. It just needs you to give up. But I didn't. I won't." That clip went viral. Then came the messages, from strangers, from survivors, from people saying, "Your words helped me keep going." And with that wave of support came oxygen. She started again. Applied for new grants, held fundraisers, got denied, tried again. And this time, doors opened. Slowly, one by one. Until Moore House became more than a dream. It became a refuge, a sanctuary, a place where kids could learn how to code and also how to cope, where girls could learn self-defense and how to find their voice in rooms that tried to shrink them, where counselors knew that healing wasn't just about therapy, but about space and music and quiet moments of safety. Aaliyah had created what she needed when she was younger. And now? Hundreds of others had it too. She walked those halls every morning before the doors opened, touched the walls with her fingers, like a mother checking her child's fever. She watched kids laugh in rooms where tears used to live. Watched teens who used to throw punches in pain now mentor younger students in robotics and poetry. She watched a generation rise through cracks because she gave them something no one had given her: room to grow without fear. The media changed its tune. Slowly. Aaliyah Moore, from scandal to safe haven. The woman who wouldn't stay down. Interviews came, speaking tours, awards. But none of that mattered as much as the letter she got one day. Handwritten, scrawled with nervous penmanship, from a young girl in Ohio. "Miss Aaliyah," it read, "when I heard your story, I stopped thinking I was too broken to help people. I want to be like you. I want to protect people too." Aaliyah cried when she read it, sat at her desk, clutching that letter like a lifeline, because it reminded her of everything: the pain, the fall, the fire, the rise, and how every piece of it had mattered. And that's why she shares it now. Openly. Publicly. With no shame. Because this isn't just a story of survival. It's a blueprint for resilience. It's a message to anyone who feels like the world is trying to break them in quiet, invisible ways. That pain you're holding, that loss you think you can't speak about, that betrayal that made you question your worth. You're not alone. Aaliyah lived it, endured it, and still stood. So if you're listening right now, if this story shook something loose in you, if you felt Aaliyah's pain like it was your own, or saw a piece of your journey mirrored in hers, then know this: you are not your lowest moment. You are the choices you make after the fall. You are the strength you find when the world wants you to disappear. You are the story no one sees coming. And if Aaliyah Moore taught us anything, it's that truth doesn't just free the one who speaks it. It lights a path for everyone watching in silence, hoping someone will go first. So here's what we take with us. Let pain refine you, not define you. Speak when silence protects the wrong people. Start again, even if it's from ashes. Protect your peace, but never at the cost of your purpose. And most importantly, don't wait for the world to give you permission to rise. Rise anyway. Now we want to hear you. Drop a comment below if Aaliyah's story gave you something. Strength, clarity, comfort, courage. Smash that like button if her fight lit a fire in you. Share your favorite quote or moment. It could help someone else get through their hardest night. And if you want more real stories like this, stories that don't shy away from the pain, but push through it, subscribe to this channel so you never miss what's coming next. Because someone out there needs these stories. Someone's waiting to hear that it's possible, that it gets better, that hope is still real. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And wherever you are, whatever you're fighting, keep going. We believe in you, just like Aaliyah never stopped believing in herself. And look what she built from the ashes.